First of all, good evening, everybody. My name is Kevin Marr. I'll be chairing tonight's event, Northern Protestants, Time for United Ireland. For those of you that have not been to one of our events before, Irish Border PUL is a discussion and advocacy group, as the name suggests on the tin, talking about Irish unity and the journey and the process towards that. So we've organised over the course of the last year a number of events, some online, some in person, where we've tried to focus the discussion on different aspects and hear from different voices, some in support of Irish unity, others not. We've done events in the past with the campaign, the anti-protocol campaign of Ben Habib, who was a good sport in coming on and doing a discussion with us. Ruth Dudley Edwards, who needs little introduction as well. So we've tried to kind of involve people with different perspectives and different voices, and not try to be an echo chamber. So with that in mind, we've got I think what will be a really interesting discussion tonight. We've got three speakers, three authors that have got three books out, very different books, but there are some similarities that I think we'll probably tease out tonight. Claire Mitchell is the author of The Ghost Limb, Alternative Protestants and the Spirit of 1798. Ben Collins is the author of Irish Unity, Time to Prepare. And Geoffrey Bell is the author of The Twilight of Unionism, Ulster and the Future of Northern Ireland. Three books, as I say, that address interconnected themes about the limitations of political unionism, with visions of an alternative future and, of course, an alternative past in Claire's book. These three writers show that the Irish Protestant character is far more heterodox than is often popularly thought. Geoffrey Bell has been writing about Irish politics for many years. His book is partly, I think, a living autopsy on Ulster Unionism from the 1960s to the present day. How has it come to be on the back foot so often, and can it endure? Indeed, what is the future for the UK in its present form? Jeff addresses lots of those questions, so that will be fascinating to hear. Claire Mitchell has written a thought-provoking book exploring some of the themes of the radical Irish Protestant tradition and identity of the late 18th century around the United Irishmen, and how that perhaps curdled into hardline unionism of the late 19th century. And Claire's got it's a really fascinating book and a journey that she's been on, so she can tell us about that and whether this radical spark can be reignited once again. And Ben Collins's book is a part personal memoir and part political analysis of the issue around Irish unity. Having been brought up in a conventional Protestant unionist background, he thoughtfully sets out explaining why he now finds himself advocating Irish unity, an idea he says in his book whose time has come. So we've got three different speakers, three speakers from a Protestant tradition in Ireland, and it's important that, of course, we don't make assumptions about Protestant and Protestant unionist identity, and I think our three speakers and three writers will spell that out, I think, very clearly tonight. Claire, I thought I might start with you, if that's okay. You address in your book a question I've often pondered, and I suspect a lot of people have, is that what happens after 1798 and the United Irishmen, and that kind of radical moment, that radical Enlightenment moment, led in very large part by Northern Protestants, which kind of drops off, and then the kind of Protestant political identity becomes something very, very different by the end of the 19th century, and pretty much from that point onwards. Would you just, for the audience tonight, would you just sort of set out what happened and why? I think that will be probably a pretty good place to start.
Nice, easy one to begin. Couple of centuries of history.
Take your time.
Yeah, no, I've been really interested in the United Irishmen, being from County Down, which is one of the top counties in Ulster and Antrim, absolute unionist heartlands, and finding in recent years all these kind of radical, beautiful histories under our feet of an alternative politics that I think has always existed on the island amongst Protestants and really flourished in 1798 when Presbyterians were subject to similar kind of penal laws as Catholics. and lost their head about it, and wanted to a deeper citizens' democracy on the island of Ireland. I titled my book The Ghost Limb. I've later found Wolfe Tone referring to Ireland being ruled by London as the amputated right hand, which I think is an interesting way of saying it, the complete kind of democratic deficit and powerlessness that you can feel in the north or on the island of Ireland when being ruled so remotely. After 1798, well, they tried for a rebellion. It was a lovely moment in history. Well, not the rebellion itself, it was brutal, but the organization and the relationships and the campaigning that led up to it. There were a lot of conservative elements in it, but there were real kernels of early radical socialism. There was a lot of women's liberation, compared to wider politics at the time. There were people who wanted a theocracy one way or another, and some of the United Irishmen were kind of a bit bigoted and ageist, but it was this amazing moment of anti-sectarian unity, I think, on the island. The rebellion was rubbish. It was suppressed really, really quickly. Towns were only held for a couple of days. And I think the crackdown was so brutal that the ideas went underground, and disremembrance is a word that Guy Biner has used for that. So it's not like Protestants forgot their history or they buried it intentionally, but I think that moment just became so full of like distress and trauma, with families split across two sides, and that's kind of rippled down the generations. I still believe that anti-sectarian spirit is there. It's showed itself, in the Fenian Society, the Gaelic League, so many other moments in history, the civil rights movement, and I think it's showing itself again today.
I mean, it's one of those things that you can kind of, it's easy to kind of overlook the fact that, from 1798 onwards and throughout, whether it's the Young Ireland movement or right through the Irish Parliamentary Party, you've got that kind of radical Protestant presence throughout all these movements, and sometimes it kind of, I don't know whether it gets written out a little bit, but it probably gets underplayed. I think that's probably the way to view it, because contemporary unionism is so wrapped around, contemporary Protestant identity is often been so wrapped around unionism and symbols of unionism that it seems, as you say, to have disremembered. I think that's a really good term. This kind of earlier tradition. I mean, what's the? I suppose just exploring that. Are there any particular inflection points where this kind of radical tradition kind of either, as you say, goes underground or is snuffed out or is downplayed? Are there any particular things that have kind of pushed it out of popular memory?
Yeah, times of violence.
Yeah.
And then times when anti-sectarian unity has blossomed. Sometimes it doesn't suit those in power, and violence is put upon the situation to divide people again. The title of the book is The Ghost Limb, and it was just to give a really quick 2-second bio of myself. I was born in Protestant community, but was raised with a really kind of radical alternative politics. For me, it was partly through the charismatic renewal movement, religious dissent. My parents are Quakers now. It was a bit stiff in terms of the religion, but really it was Catholics and Protestants during the Troubles sharing their lives, and it was a really profoundly anti-sectarian movement. We were always Irish, always had Irish passports, never had a British passport. Our family were very anti-colonial, anti-war pacifists. There was never a poppy through our house. If there was, it was a white one, to symbolize peace. And the ghost limb is my way of trying to describe how it feels to be a Protestant with all that kind of alternative politics, but to live, as I mentioned, in a very unionist kind of dominated area of the north, and not disremembering your history, but almost feeling the ghost limb, like something is cut off from you. It's hidden, it's hard to access, it's like a pang. You need to keep your music down lower than you want. You can't really feel free in the pub to talk about your politics loudly. So I think, that hiddenness is something that has been a theme and is particularly pronounced in my lifetime during the Troubles, and the peace, or the imperfect peace we've had since, has allowed.
How typical do you feel you are, or atypical do you feel you are, as you know, from the background that you've got? I mean, are you just sense there are lots of people like you, possibly that you know that aren't politically active or writing books about some of this, but perhaps share this kind of very specific identity that you've got?
Whenever I started writing, I thought we were a little family of weirdos and that there might be a couple more people, but really we were in a very small pond. As I've been writing the book, though, one of the most striking things is getting messages from people going, "You too? Really? I thought I was the only one." And I think you got to think about in terms of like throwing a stone in a pond and the ripple. Like, I would vote for reunification tomorrow. For me, it's a hard thing. I think partition was unjust, that we can't make something good on the bones of that. And so tomorrow, if there was a border poll, me and my dog Winnie Carney would be down at the station putting our X on the border poll. So I think that kind of Protestant is probably a fairly rare beast. You could probably look at that as the 4 or 5% of people in the surveys and polls that are Protestant Irish or Protestants for Unity. The book, though, I talked to about 20 other people in it, and that's kind of a wider ripple out, if you like. They're all very kind of free thinking, independent-minded Protestants who really value equality and anti-sectarianism above empire or ethnicity. You might look for them in the Protestant undecideds, or the no religion unities, or the no religion undecideds. And I think that that is a really significant group. And then I suppose I would say, if the very edges of the ripple, you would get people like in my wider family who would be still Unionist, you know, at the last election voting for the UUP, but what the content of their unionism has changed. You know, I would have had phone calls 6 years ago, whenever Arlene Foster had written to everybody saying that Martin McGuinness was going to be deputy first minister. And I had relatives in an absolute blind panic over this. And the same people were ringing me after our most recent assembly election, kicking off the phone call with Céad Míle Fáilte in Irish, saying, "Mary Lou's our new mommy now, and she says not to be afraid." And that's very facetious in a way, but it does tell me that while the worries aren't there, and these people are probably still going to vote for unionist parties and pro-union vote in a border poll, well, maybe they might not. And even if they do, I think there's a softening of the panic, obviously not amongst the hard line, and I'm sure other people will talk about that.
I mean, that's a nice description, softening of the panic. I mean, the Irish Times described your book as amongst other things, as a window into a society in slow transition, which I thought was a very interesting phrase. That it suggests that there is a transition, and you kind of, I think you kind of allude to that there are people that perhaps perhaps some of the fear or the hostility or you know or the kind of real passion about what might change constitutionally is leveling off, perhaps, with some people. I wouldn't want to overstate that, but you know, softening of the panic. That there's perhaps a space where you will get people who will really want Irish unity. There'll be people who, you know, wouldn't mind Irish unity, and there's people perhaps who can live with it. And I wonder, in that space, I mean, that strikes me as, you know, as an interesting space where some of the people that might identify as being a bit unaligned or voting for parties that are not perhaps, you know, too extreme in their position, that there's a group of people who could live with change. Whether they would really welcome it is another thing, but they can actually live with it. They can see that, look, it's not that bad. And I wonder if that's in a sense part of the group that you're talking about.
Well, these same people are ringing me now saying they think they have a bit of a ghost limb, and they think their men's walking group and prayer group is a ghost limb too. Do you know, I think that there just hasn't been a steady, well, not to undermine the efforts of others, but it's been difficult to find those voices amongst the Protestant community who can articulate that alternative radical Protestantism. Certainly amongst my friends and the people in the book, since Brexit, really, I think, whilst we've always been armchair kind of Irish lefties, it has become untenable to be silent. And I think a big thing that comes out in the book is the kind of moving away from oppression or repression or suppression of these feelings and towards a kind of liberation and finding your voice and finding a tribe and finding that you need to speak, that you can't fear to speak, because this cannot be what we pass on to our children. And I think, I mean, we'll probably talk about Lundies and Lundian later. I think the risks are a little bit less now, and I think that all of us who are on these journey have wider Unionist families. And like, there's a story of a guy in the book, DP, Orange Man Dad. He's brilliant at Irish. He got a silver fáinne, making amazing progress, but all throughout writing the book, and he would call himself a Republican now, no problem with that. He couldn't tell his family that he was learning Irish. He's doing a diploma in it now, top of his class. And by the end of the book, he told them what he was doing, and they were so proud of him. So we're all kind of bringing not families with us, but we're all part of this wider, the broads who are liberating themselves. We're in conversation with those Unionists because we love them, we're related to them, they're our families.
Yeah. Well, so that's an interesting point, that you know, this may never gain critical mass, but the fact that you've got, you know, a GAA club opens up in East Belfast, or the work that, you know, somebody like Linda Irvine, given who her brother was, you know, is such an advocate of Irish language, that there's obviously people in this space that can kind of find things that they value in the other, if you like, and that process of some level of kind of normalization of the society, you know, is really interesting. I mean, do you sense this is, I mean, you say, you know, this is gathering pace, or this is heading in a particular direction, or you know, and I mean, you know, it strikes me, it's always been very interesting that you know, the poor old United Irishmen and the radical spirit of that time is almost completely written out of that kind of, particularly the kind of Protestant Unionist historical account. And you know, when I go to Belfast and you know, there's you know, there's much more sense of that period than perhaps there used to be. And I wonder if that might be, if we've got language and we've got sport, whether people might be able to reconnect with that kind of radical politics again.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely found, I mean, as you've said, there's a huge revival of the popularity of 1798 histories, which have been pretty much written out of public space in the North. One of the most surprising things I find about it is that it's a space that you say Unionists have erased, but that's not what I find. I actually find it was a portal that I could step into with Ulster Scots speakers, and sometimes with Orange men, sometimes with people with very conservative theology whose politics looks very different from my own, but who could relate to the want of democracy, the want for religious freedom, you know, the ideas of not being told what to do, that kind of Thran Ulster independence. And so for me, the 1798 stuff is getting people in the same room, Republicans and Loyalists, in my experience in my hometown this year, all kind of drawn invisibly into this kind of portal of ideas. And for me, just even being in the same room is a good start. And I think it has enabled conversations about democracy that I wouldn't have thought were possible otherwise. And it can help people, if you take the words border, pole and reunification out of it, sharing that space can get people digging for the deeper values and the deeper solidarities which are shared. And I think there's a lot of legs in that can be very healing, and probably be something that could be useful to underpin constitutional change in whatever direction. That's
brilliant. No, thanks for that. I'm going to bring Geoffrey Bell in a second. What we'll do is perhaps come back to the speakers at various points a little bit later. But I'll just turn to you if I can, Jeff. as I say, you've been writing about these matters for a very long time. The Twilight of Unionism. I saw the review of your book in the Sunday Times. I think other people will have seen it by Max Hastings, who described the position of Unionists as, quote, a tragedy. Nobody loves them save their own shrinking band of zealots, he wrote. I suppose my obvious question to you is it really over for Unionism? If so, why? And kind of what comes after it, really? And I suppose the obvious answer is, if we had Irish unity, what's the point of being a Unionist? But how would Unionists dissipate and perhaps recongregate around something in the future?
Yeah, before I answer that, and I sort of will obviously answer, I just want to just say this about Claire's book. I remember what's this, about 15 years ago, I was accused by a British socialist who didn't support Irish unity or didn't support Irish self-determination as having a guilt complex about being a Protestant, you see. And then I said to him, well, what have I got to feel guilty about? After all, we actually founded the Irish Republican movement in the first place anyway, in the sort of 1798, you know. So Claire's brought that all back to me. Now, when you call something the twilight of unionism, I suppose you're sort of hedging your bets a bit, aren't you? You know, you're not saying that's definitely going to go down the hill. It's definitely going to disappear, but you are saying that seems the most likely end of it. And I do go back to the 19th and early 20th century as well, to try and find the roots of why this should happen. And I suppose what I argue, and I argue most strongly in the book, is that unionism has been based on notions of supremacy, right? The English being better than the Irish, being more civilized and more educated and so on. And within Ireland, the Protestants, who were, of course, descendants from the English and the Scottish, being more civilized than the Catholic, than the Irish Catholics. And that, to an extent, notion, I think is a very important one in the entire history of the Unionist movement. And it's something they have never really got shot of. I mean, I think one of the things I also highlight in the book is the decline of the last few years of what used to be called welfare unionism, which was that unionism was going to break with its traditions, break with its sort of sectarian history, and simply become a sort of advocate for the sort of welfare which the British state can allegedly deliver. Now, the whole sort of welfare argument, of course, is now a bit redundant anyway, given the state of the NHS and sort of other things. But I mean, that shift away, that return to the more traditional supremacist notions, you know, I think that, if you like, the classical example of this was when Ian Paisley, the Sun, said that in an Irish border poll it had to be more than 50% +1 voting. And I mean, this was like, you know, valuing, i.e. anti-sort of unionist votes it should actually count more. Anti-sort of unionist votes should count less than pro-sort of unionist votes. And I mean, that this, as I say, was a return to so much of the supremacist notions which have been characteristic of sort of unionism, really from the middle of the 19th century sort of onwards. I mean, I try to obviously look at the whole question of why it is sort of why unionism is now in sort of crisis. And I think whatever one thinks of the prospects of a united Ireland, there is no denying that over the last few years, unionism has been in a crisis. And I tend to, although obviously things like Brexit and the protocol and things have been the immediate cause of this, I tend to go back to the Good Friday Agreement or the Belfast Agreement, and I see that this, to an extent, was opposed by a significant amount of unionist opinion in the north, and remained, and in fact, that dissatisfaction with the Good Friday Agreement grew. But obviously, they couldn't come out, and they haven't come out recently and said this must be scrapped or something, but they're looking for other ways forward, and they haven't got those other ways forward. So I think in terms of a political project, unionism is in real trouble, if you like. The other factor, of course, which I think it's important when you're trying to look at where unionism goes from here, is the general decline in the support for the union with people in Great Britain. I mean, I recall that in 1914, for instance, up to 500,000 people. Some estimate it was 100,000, other estimate it was 500,000 people gathered in Hyde Park to listen to Edward Carson, and to support the Ulster fight back against Irish home rule. Well, if there was a sort of movement now, which was on the edge of re-granting Irish self-determination, you would be lucky if you would get sort of 50 people in sort of Hyde Park do this. So the whole nature of unionism is, because it is relying on a link with essentially the sort of Tory party, but also at times with the Labour Party, is in crisis, because it is more friendless now than it has sort of ever been. So that, to an extent, are, if you like, two of the reasons why I think it has sort of reached a sort of crisis. And I can't really see, certainly in the sort of long term, how it gets out of that crisis. If you say the end of this sort of unionism is a Sinn Féin member being the first minister, is that what the sort of union is really about? Is that what the precious union sort of is about? Obviously it's not. And I think I hope that to an extent, especially because of the constant betrayals as unionists see by sort of British politicians, right, from Edward Heath to sort of Margaret Thatcher, so on and so on, that sooner or later a significant number of unionist-minded people are sort of going to say, why do we keep trusting these people? They've betrayed us time and time again, as indeed they actually have, and because of their own standards. So that again is another sort of conflict, which I think just might spur at least some Protestants to say, well, there must be a different way forward. Now, I don't exaggerate that. I agree with what Claire sort of said about that, that you're talking 4 or 5% at the present time. But I mean, there does seem a sort of logic behind that type of sentiment growing as the sort of years progress.
it's interesting just to pick up on a couple of points if I can, and ask you another question in a second. But you mentioned about unionism and kind of welfare unionism, and just a reflection really that it just struck me that there was a point probably 15 years ago, perhaps when Peter Robinson took over from Paisley, where there was, I wouldn't hesitate to use the word normal politics, but normal for Northern Ireland, I suppose, where there was a kind of a business-like sense to the executive and to things, and I did wonder whether you might start to see even the DUP sort of morph into a kind of orange social democratic party, for want of a better phrase, and it seems that what we've had with Arlene Foster is a rolling back of that, resiling from that kind of meeting in the middle. Let's do business where we can for the betterment of everybody, even if we do it, from the position of being from the tribe. It seems to me that identity politics again has kind of crept in. Things have become quite sour and quite difficult, and that's not been to the benefit of unionism, because unionism keeps losing these battles, losing ground, just as it has done really from the time of Stormont being prorogued in the early 70s. Every time there's an issue comes up, unionism finds itself on the wrong side of it ultimately. I mean, is this kind of, I suppose this kind of withering takes a very long time, and I was saying to Kevin before, it's like that old, I think it's an old Lancashire phrase that a creaking gate can last a very long time. How long will this twilight last, do we think? Are we in the kind of final days of Northern Ireland as part of the UK? Are we inexorably moving towards that border pole? And is unionism just going to fight one last hurrah after another until it loses, do you think?
I mean, I think first of all, the whole thing, what sort of unionism had, unionism had a choice, didn't it, a couple of years back, when, according to the opinion polls, the Alliance Party was sort of growing on the one hand, and on the other hand, traditional unionist voice was growing, and the leadership of the DUP had a choice to which of those two audiences to try and appeal to. And essentially they appealed to the traditional unionist voice vote, and which is they backed them on the Irish protocol and so on, which previously they hadn't been so strong about. So I mean that, to an extent, I think was quite a significant moment in their history. As to how long it has lasted, well, I'm for instance a member of an organisation in London called Labour for Irish Unity, which is for members of the Labour Party and the Irish community here who support the reunification of Ireland. And I suppose our aim would be, at our present aim, one of our present aims anyway, would be to say to the Labour leadership that you have to offer a border poll within the lifetime of the next Labour government. So that's sort of 7 years. Of course, it's just saying that it's actually going to sort of be that, isn't it? Like any guarantee that you're going to get what I would regard as a positive vote. But I think the crisis within sort of unionism is sort of so deep that it can only get worse in sort of many ways. So I mean that is, as I say, is a sort of optimistic timeline I would have, and I think, of course, getting the Labour Party to adopt such a policy is sort of easier said than sort of done, and I think we all sort of recognise that. But I mean, there has been some slight movement recently within the sort of Labour Party to move away from its own more traditional unionist positions. Although the paper which Gordon Brown produced today shows a little sign of that on sort of constitutional questions in Britain. But it is he does pay homage to the Good Friday Agreement, which he calls that. He doesn't call it the Belfast agreement, which is quite
I noticed that
which is quite sort of interesting, because Labour Party people in the past have recently sort of called it that.
They have.
So I mean, you know,
things
things like
actually.
that, things like that.
Seems to have had a unilateral rebranding at some stage, and it's gone back
that's
to.
right. That's right.
Belfast
I mean, I sort of. In the book, I called it the GFBA, just to try and not adopt such a much a sort of neutral stance, but more to say, well, yeah, you know, we sort of recognize that the people have different traditions here, you know.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jeff. I'm going to bring in Ben Collins in a second, and I've just got an eye on a little box in my screen with questions and comments from people as well. So if it's okay, I'm going to ask Ben to speak in a second, and then I will try. My eyes will be flicking all over the screen as I try and read these questions and hopefully do justice to some of the points being raised. And then what we'll do is feed those in and come back to all three speakers again, and after we've spoken with Ben. So Ben, we'll turn to you if that's okay. So your book, Irish Unity: Time to Prepare, is very interesting and very noteworthy, and has attracted obviously a lot of attention given who you are. And I'll let you kind of explain your journey in a little minute. But just one observation really from me is that a bit like me, you're a, for want of a better phrase, a political professional. You work in the game. So your book is not, as I read it, a kind of, a dewy-eyed account of, it's not a road to Damascene thing, or it's a very kind of hard-headed players, if I can put it like that, players assessment of the state of the debate. It's very hard-headed, it's very grounded. I'll let you explain a bit about your journey, because I mean it is really fascinating. But I suppose the one thing I want to leave you with is again, how many people in your networks do you sense share the same analysis and outlook that you do?
Well, that's thanks very much, Kevin, and thanks to Irish Border Pool for having me on. It's good to be here with such a good turnout. Yeah, I mean, the reason why I wrote the book is because I feel really strongly. I'd always felt Irish as well as British growing up, and then my sense of Britishness dissipated, particularly as I lived and worked in Britain, and my sense of Irishness only grew. And the Good Friday Agreement was the sort of the gateway that allowed me to think about Irish unity in the way I hadn't before, because I come from very much a Presbyterian background. I am at the centre, although I didn't know anything about the United Irishmen until I was at university, I think, and I didn't get to study Irish history at school, so I sort of had to teach myself that. But for me, I have a lot of friends who are very much open to the idea. I think what was a long-term aspiration for me of a United Ireland became an urgent necessity because of Brexit. And it's not just about what's happening on this island, it's about looking across what's happening in Britain. Scottish independence, that's not going to go away. But whenever you hear people saying it's a voluntary union, but they can't set out, no member of the UK government is willing to set out how or when the Scottish people can have the right to self-determination again, I find that horrifying, having lived and worked in Scotland for 8.5 years. And I think it's a combination of those factors. Looking at the dysfunction, the chaos in Westminster, I left. I went to university in Dundee in 1994, along with half of Northern Ireland, I think, and that was a really good experience. Met people from all across Ireland in a way that just hadn't been possible prior to the sea fires and the end of the Troubles, and. It was great, even just going away to university in September 94, end of August, early September 1994, and then coming back that first Christmas and seeing the difference in the atmosphere in Belfast was great. But I got involved after I finished my studies. I moved back to Scotland, and I wanted to get involved in bread and butter politics. So I joined the Conservative Party in the hope and expectation that Ken Clarke, as a socio-liberal pro-European, would become leader, and he didn't. And this guy, Ian Duncan Smith, that nobody had ever heard of, except a few, became leader. So I spent 2 increasingly uncomfortable years as a party member, and then left because I just couldn't handle the increasing Euro hostility, I think is the only way to call it. But at that same time, being outside of Northern Ireland, I haven't been brought up in the sort of the Protestant Unionist background. I was determined I wasn't going to be bombed into United Ireland. I wasn't going to be threatened into it by violence or threats of violence. And whenever that stopped, it allowed me to look at things anew. And then living in Scotland, I remember going to the 2002 SNP party conference where they started talking about fiscal autonomy. And that really resonated with me. And I thought, gosh, you know, this idea about just being at the end of a check from Whitehall doesn't really strike me as the way to do things. You know, you want proper grown-up politics and a proper grown-up society. And that's sort of my thinking. So whenever I moved back to Northern Ireland, I got involved in liberal politics. So I joined, this is like years later in 2011, a friend asked me to do some leafleting for the Alliance Party, which I did. And I thought, well, I've done that leafleting, I might as well join the party because they had, I would have to declare it for the, unfortunately, as you know, Kevin, being a player, I don't think anyone's ever called me that before. They probably never will again, but you have to, you know, you can be both very political, but so many jobs you can't be political at all. So anyway, I joined the party, and I could see, having left the Conservatives in 2003, and seeing how the Lib Dems, who didn't stand in Northern Ireland, so they were effectively a sister party to Alliance, I joined them at the same time that I joined Alliance, because I thought, rightly, I think history would say, they were a constraining factor on the Tory government. And we've seen how quickly the wheels have come off. I mean, I know a lot of people would say the wheels were never on, but things have been measurably worse, I think, since 2015, where there wasn't somebody in the room to try and moderate what the Tories were doing at all. And I think that's sad. But, you know, the other thing I'd say is a lot of my friends come from a similar background, and they're either absolutely up for a United Ireland or they're open to the debate. And there's a number of reasons for that. It's they look at the dysfunction and the chaos in Westminster. They look at Brexit. They see that is an English nationalist project. They see that Scotland is on course to get out of the room whenever they actually can do that. They can see that's going to happen. And it's just unionism in Northern Ireland isn't open and progressive. And I find it galling that unionism in Northern Ireland still persists with, we want exactly the same rights as the rest of the UK, except whenever it comes to women's right to choose, except whenever it comes to equal marriage, and except whenever it comes to protecting the Indigenous language. You know, I also worked in Wales for 5 years, and it was the Welsh Conservatives that actually brought a lot of recognition and a lot of support for the Welsh language. They're the ones that brought forward S4C, the Welsh language station, media channel. And I think it's desperately sad that unionism just seems to become an ever more narrower version of the world. And I don't think unionism by and large has actually joined the 21st century. And I don't take any pleasure saying that. You know, I often say, you know, what we want is hope and prosperity for our unionist brothers and sisters. And that isn't just a phrase for me. I actually have two brothers that are unionists. So, you know, it means a lot to me. I travel, I live in East Belfast, and I travel into the city centre through inner East Belfast. And on the one hand, it's great. You've got Turas, the Irish language school, which is, you know, ever more popular. But there's also a lot of really dilapidated shops and homes. And I think it's terrible that, you know, large segments of the PUL community they've been left behind, but their votes have been taken for granted. And I think both of those things are completely wrong. And we have to offer sort of a pathway to prosperity. And I think if we can remove the border from Ireland, that will remove a source of division. It won't remove the division in itself. I think we need to look at these things. We need to have, you know, you look at how, I mean, I live in Belfast, but I work out of the Dublin office, and I see the prosperity there's in Dublin. Of course, it's not perfect, but you know, I think by us combining what we do and working together, I think it can make a huge difference, and opening up the political discourse, because Northern Ireland's too small on its own. And I think having the same two parties in government in the south, essentially since the foundation of the state, or certainly since 1932 or 33, there's a real opportunity there to freshen things up by taking an all-island approach. And I'll finish on this, that I'm not an economist, but you don't need to be an economist to know that duplication of services is less efficient and less effective than having one of something. And because of partition, we duplicate so many things, whether it's a health service or anything else. And I think, you know, we just can't afford that.
Thanks for that, Ben. Sorry, it just froze just there at the end. But can I ask you this? I mean, there's a constant theme going through your book about Brexit and the impacts of Brexit, and you know, Brexit changes a lot of things. I mean, you know, it's had a profound effect on UK politics for obvious reasons. But it's obviously galvanised the independence case in Scotland and refreshed it, and it's done things in Northern Ireland as well. And I wonder, given the kind of disparity with obviously lots of nationalists voting against Brexit, voting to stay in the European Union anyway, what on the kind of on the other side of the equation, on the kind of the Protestant Union side of the equation, what are people making of Brexit now, do you think? And do you think that is a gateway issue for lots of, I think, moderate people in business, people who are sort of saying, God, this is not working out very well. Is that a gateway to get people to perhaps come over to Irish unity as a potential remedy?
I think there's two aspects to it. There are business people who see the protocol as potentially having benefits and having access to two markets. Now that does increase the trade and commerce on a north-south basis, and it slowly detaches or slowly moves Northern Ireland's focus away from Britain to the rest of Ireland and the EU. I think people see the benefit of that. They also see that the DUP, having called for Brexit, having not put forward any positive, constructive model for how Brexit should be implemented, are now, having initially saying they saw this as a gateway opportunity, they're now saying that they want to get rid of the protocol. They want to have I've often described it as they want the same rubbish deal as there is for Hull. And that's no disrespect to Hull. I'm sure it's a lovely place. I haven't been there yet. But my point is, so I think there's frustration that people don't see that sort of agility, because that's one of the things I said in my book, is that if unionism could embrace that prosperity that could come from having the best access of any part of the UK to both the UK market and the EU, then people may not vote for Irish unity in numbers if they feel they've already got the best deal. So there's that aspect, but then the other aspect is very much that I think a lot of people from the Protestant Unionist and Loyalist community feel that they have been let down by the UK government again, in the same way a lot of people felt let down by the Anglo-Irish Agreement. They now feel let down by the protocol. You had Boris Johnson, before he was Prime Minister, saying no British Prime Minister would ever put a border down the Irish Sea. And of course, that's exactly what he did. I think there was a lack of honesty, because there was just no way that any UK government that has any kind of sense was ever going to attempt to put a hard border on the island of Ireland. Now, there's a separate discussion about whether Unionists thought that was going to be the outcome, and maybe the desired outcome for at least some of them. But so I think there are those two aspects of, we potentially have this way for increased prosperity, but unionism are trying to block that. And on the other hand, you've got people from the PUL community that feel that they've been effectively thrown overboard by the UK government. But I think it's about, this can't be seen as victory of one side over the other. I think there'll definitely be a border poll in the next decade. I would be more positive. I think at the moment you have around 40% that vote for nationalist or Republican parties in Northern Ireland. I think you have a lot of people like myself, a lot of my friends that are either in favour of Irish unity or open to it. They're never going to vote for Sinn Féin. They probably won't vote for the SDLP. At the moment, they may vote for Alliance or the Greens, or just not bother voting at all. But they are absolutely people, I'm adamant, that are open to the idea of unity. And I think that's why we need to plan now, put an evidence-based discussion, and then put a plan to the people. And whenever there's something actually tangible to vote on, I think we will see the numbers falling the way of Irish unity. And surprisingly, it's not going to be a complete blowout, but I think there'll be much bigger support for it than people have expected to date. But I think that's part of the key thing of unionism. It's just, I agree with Jeff entirely. It has been based to date on supremacy. We have the numbers, therefore we don't need to have any intellectual thinking beyond that. We can just vote whatever way we want. But I think that's no longer the case.
That's brilliant. Thanks for that, Ben. What I'm going to try and do, we've got a sudden flurry of questions that are coming in, so I'm going to try and bring some of these in. Apologies to everybody if you've got really detailed questions, because I'm going to probably try and amalgamate them. It's a kind of sort of in the Labour Party tradition, it's called compositing. So I'll try and capture the gist of some of these questions, and apologies, my hand-eye coordination is not sharp enough to probably read them all out. But I wanted just to go back to you, Claire, if we can. There's a few people raised the question of unity between peoples. I think is probably the way of describing it. You know, we have you know, segregated housing, we have segregated communities, we have segregated education in the north, and if there's going to be, you know, a new single island, a new island, however we're describing it, what are the things that usefully could be done even at this point to try and promote unity between peoples? Have you got any reflections on that?
Well, my reflection is mostly that people are already doing it for themselves, and we do not have the political structures to support it. Online dating apps have changed things a lot, and gay bars have always been desegregated, you know, a very anti-sectarian space. I sent my kids, I'm Protestant, so is my husband, to a Catholic school. We thought we were the great progressives doing that. When we got there, the UDA commander's kid also goes to the school, full of mixed marriages. And do you know, my perception is that in flipping pigeon club, photography club, slimmers world, that people are already tangling and sharing their lives, and we're actually pretty good at it, and we're pretty sophisticated. We know when to use humor, when to back off, when to make it awkward. So I do not actually worry about people in the north being able to share our lives, but we absolutely lack the political structures to kind of facilitate that. The agreement had the best of intentions and was totally necessary in dividing, you know, a unionist bloc and a nationalist bloc and power sharing between the two. But as time has gone on, you can see them inching out further on the seesaw, and resources allocated accordingly between Sinn Féin and the DP, sometimes to prop up which I would have supported in the past, the work of former combatants, but now at 25 years since the agreement, I think that's taken on a bit of a toxic nature. So yeah, people are already mixing themselves in their love lives and in schools and in housing where it's private housing. So I would love to see the state taking a much more proactive role. Unfortunately, it benefits the parties, the big parties in power, to kind of keep divvying up resources in this way.
I mean, it's interesting to hear people, in a sense, doing it for themselves. And I've just jotted down, we've seen the kind of Tinderization of a post-conflict society, which is a fascinating fascinating concept. Thanks for that. Jeff, if I can ask you, somebody put in the comments box about stretching my kind of Lancashire analogy, that if Scotland votes for independence, the hinges will drop off on Northern Ireland anyway. Can I just get your reflections on the kind of the wider impact? I mean, you've been in Britain a very long time. You've been writing about these issues for a very long time. I mean, where and you touched on this a little bit earlier anyway, but in terms of elite opinion, if I can put it like that, Westminster, the British media, I mean, where do you sense things have changed in perhaps the last 30 years or so? And what does that mean in terms of Scotland, devolution, Westminster, the protocol, you know, the way that, you know, political unionism has been treated and mistreated by conservative governments? I mean, how important is that in the calculation, do you think?
I think it's, as I said, I mean, I think it is very significant, you know. I mean, I just don't, I mean, even though there were sort of unionists, you know, people like Michael Gove and sort of all this business that he was a great sort of orange man and so on and so on. In the end, he said, no, I'm not sort of like that at all anymore. And I mean, so you had that change. I mean, I think what was very sort of interesting, for instance, I mean, the fact that that my book was given a page in the Sunday Times. I mean, I've sort of written sort of other books. I would never have got a page in the sort of Sunday Times, you know, 5, 10, 15 years ago, you know. And I think that the fact I was sort of given that the book was sort of given that page was to an extent a reflection, not so much on the value of the book or otherwise, but a sort of indication that the time has come for that the Irish unity, if you like, and Britain getting out of Ireland is an idea whose time has sort of come, right? And obviously you don't have the type of material sort of interests in the partition settlement which the British state and the British ruling class used to have. I mean, you don't get the fact that they needed Northern Ireland for defence reasons, or that they had all these riches in sort of Northern Ireland which they needed to defend, or that they sort of viewed the sort of Northern Protestants as their kith and kin, which they don't anymore. You know, I mean, all these sort of specific psychological, economic, military reasons for unionism in Britain have sort of withered away. I mean, the only question is whether can either Labour or the sort of Tory party can really be sort of bothered. Might think it's more trouble than it's sort of worth to sort of try and break the sort of union once and for all. You know, I don't think there is a lot of strong pro-unionist feeling anymore, but I also don't think there's a strong support for an Irish self-determination solution. I mean, I think that's very obvious. As I say, it is sort of up to people like the organisation I'm involved with, and sort of other people, and through books and through television, sort of documentaries and sort of also on this, to try and say that, well, listen, Ireland remains a very important issue, right? And it remains especially an important issue for sort of people who want to see the divisions of the working class in both the North and in Ireland as a whole dispensed with, you know, and I think if we try and figure out how we do that, right, and there's no easy solutions for it. I mean, I was in the sort of civil rights movement in the 1960s, and I mean, we all tried, the sort of leaders of the civil rights movement, Michael Farrell, Eamon McCann, Bernadette Devlin, were all dedicated to try and win over the Protestant working class, if you like, to a new and better first Northern Ireland and then Ireland as a whole. And quite frankly, very little success was achieved in that. But I do hope again there is now more of a sort of opening than sort of has been, because the whole basis of, you know, if you like, loyalism for God in Ulster. I mean, the English don't believe in God anymore, and you know, and or 60% don't, and they haven't any sort of interest in sort of Ulster sort of anymore. So I think there's a chance there, and I hope that sort of there's a chance there to say, you know, it is sort of far better to you know, it is not very often that sort of people get the opportunity to create a new state and a new society, right? There is an opportunity, and not just for the nationalist population, but for the unionist population there, to sort of create this new state and new society, as indeed the Protestants did in the helped to do in the American Revolution, you know, and the role they played then, you know, was again quite sort of interesting. They played quite a progressive role sort of there. So, you know, as I say, these are hopes, but I also think there is sound evidence to think that there are sort of opportunities and the trick now is to build a program, build a process of sort of how we take advantage of these opportunities.
It's very, very interesting, and of course, I mean, if people haven't seen the review of your book written by Max Hastings, former editor of the Daily Telegraph, military historian, liberal Tory icon, who's got basically the same opinion of the future as that Jeff has, which is striking in itself, that there is an opinion within Britain that's actually, quite kind of comfortable with the prospect of constitutional change. And there was that opinion poll there a few years ago of Brexiteers that valued a kind of proper Brexit over maintaining the current integrity of the United Kingdom. And I think I agree very much, Jeff, with what you just said. And I've written it myself previously, that there's something exhilarating at being at the birth of a nation. And it's something the Scots clearly feel. It's something people in Ireland clearly feel. And it's something as well, as Ben pointed out, that Brexit is very much kind of an English nationalist project. That's something that Brexiteers feel very much as well. And in their fervour, they're not desperately bothered about, as I read it with the opinion polls, not desperately bothered about whether Northern Ireland stays or goes, frankly. So there's some very, very interesting political dynamics taking shape in British politics. If I can just come to Ben, I'll come back to you shortly, Jeff, if I may. But Ben, I just wanted to get a sense that there's a few questions here, and again, to try and amalgamate what the gist, what does, and again, approaching you here as a kind of, as a political pragmatist, what do campaigners for constitutional change put on the table that might persuade people from a Protestant Unionist background to think, all right, there might be something in this for me? Or what safeguards need to be put in place to try and get them to at least engage with the debate? What do people like me or Kevin Rooney, what have we got to kind of ante up to get a hearing?
Well, I think first of all, people can get very exercised about symbolism. I don't think that's the starting point. I think the beauty of being in favour of Irish unity now is the fact that if you look at bread and butter issues, I genuinely believe it's not a case of I want Irish unity in spite of the impact on bread and butter issues. I think it's precisely because of that. So I think there's a number of factors, whether if you want to have a better health service, I think it can be delivered through Irish unity, and I'll explain why in a second. But I think it's about, in terms of safeguards, the Good Friday Agreement itself and the European Convention on Human Rights, those are mechanisms that will protect and provide safeguards and assurances for the PUL community, I believe, in New Ireland, and offers that kind of certainty that we want people from the Protestant Unionist background to be cherished and regarded. Diversity through strength and all that sort of stuff, or strength through diversity. I should know, I've quoted it in my book. But the point is that I think, you look at the Republic now, it isn't this Catholic, Gaelic, agricultural, agrarian economy. It's much more, it's often described as a push nationalist economy, and it's very much outward looking. It's often described as one of the most open economies in the world, and that's very good in some ways, but clearly there are things that can be improved on, as there can in Northern Ireland. So I think it's about providing those safeguards, like a package of proposals that includes those safeguards, but also showing how you're going to provide a pathway to prosperity. I mean, in East Belfast, where I'm from, Protestant boys in particular have really suffered with educational underachievement and underattainment, and we need to do more through that. I think being part of the EU, the fact that there's no question that you can be part of Erasmus, that you can live, work, study all across the EU with no barriers whatsoever, that's going to be a positive thing. I think, to come back to the healthcare side of things, you'll know that in England, they passed the Health and Social Care Act earlier this year, which allows the health service in England to share patient data with third parties. That could ultimately lead to that data being sold off to private companies. And once it's out the door, you can't regain it. You can't control it again. And the reason why that's important is because in terms of healthcare, digital healthcare is increasingly important. And to be able to get full access of that and the full benefits of digital healthcare in terms of monitoring people's health and well-being, but also in terms of undertaking robotic surgery, for example, and monitoring people's recovery from surgery, that is all improved where digital health is used, and lots of companies like Microsoft are heavily involved in that. But to be able to do that, you have to abide by the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations, which sounds very boring and complicated, but the point is the EU is really strict in this, and the US president has just signed an executive order recently that is supposed to help data flows between the US and the EU. Because if the EU is not content, it just won't happen. EU regulations stretch far beyond the geographic boundaries of the 27 European countries. So what it's going to mean is the UK has threatened to diverge on data protection from the EU ever since Brexit, but it hasn't done that to any great extent yet. But if they do, companies like Microsoft and Google that are heavily involved in digital health and will be increasingly involved, they're going to have to decide, do they want to put all their eggs in the basket of 50 odd 60 million people, or do they want to be fully embedded in a market of 500 million people and the benefits that come from that? So that's just one very specific example of how, in terms of healthcare, if you're part of a United Ireland, you're going to have access to this digital infrastructure stretching across an entire continent, and the benefits that can come from that, and the investment that can come from that, and the sharing of best practice and knowledge, and what the outcomes are, and how you can best treat people, and so on, or being part of a very small insular single market within part of the UK where you won't have access to that, and where your data is potentially being sold off to the highest bidder.
That's fascinating, and I think for me the interesting part of this conversation about the future is in the granular detail, the economics, the opportunities there. And you said at the start, and I totally agree with you about kind of identity and symbolism and all the rest of it, which is often a cul-de-sac in these kinds of discussions. But let me just throw this one in at you. Somebody's just put in the comments, which I think it's an interesting point. I'd just be interested in your reflection on it, really. I'll just read it out. To what extent would an unconditional apology from Republicans for the deaths and maimings of people from the PUL community during the Troubles help with reconciliation? Would that make any difference? Is that something that, as I say, creates an opening for a conversation, or does it not really lead anywhere?
No, I think it'd be great. I mean, I've said I'm completely opposed to violence. I'm completely opposed to all threats of violence, and always have been. I mean, I think I quote it in my book, I can't remember the exact quote, but Nelson Mandela, I think he apologized, didn't he, for certain violence that happened through the ANC before the end of apartheid. I think there would be a real sense of generosity. One of the things that I said recently in an article was there's a difference between commemoration and celebration. The very fact that the Queen was willing, the late Queen was willing and able to go to the Garden of Remembrance in Dublin and pay her respects to the 1916 Easter Rising people, that if she could do that as head of state, sovereign head of state, then anybody from a unionist background should be able to acknowledge that. I mean, I think for me, the key thing is I will never agree with certain people on what happened in the past, but this is about the future, and I think it's about putting that to the past. We've got to learn. It's an awful saying the only lesson of history we ever learn. You think deeply about it and you realize that's really depressing. But my point is that yes, I think an apology would be great. We do live in a world where there is an ongoing outrage factory, and we have to be mindful of that. And we've seen it with, even the most learned human rights academics can say they're opposed to all forms of violence, and people will still say, but you haven't mentioned specifically this kind of violence, which I think is just, it's nitpicking. I think that would be great, but I think the key thing for me is it's about, we can commemorate and remembering the past, but not celebrating the past, because there were wrongs on all sides. And coming from a Unionist Protestant background, I remember talking to one of my colleagues in the during the time I was working as a press officer, and saying, we were brought up to believe those on the British side were the ones in the white hats, the Republicans were the ones in the black hats, but you realize it was many levels of grace as part of that. So there were problems and issues across the board, but absolutely, I think it's about I think there should be apologies for on all sides for the pain and hurt that's been caused, but we have to try and build something better. And I want the unionist side and I want the pro-union side, put forward your case, give us your positive case. Don't just try. We're at the stage where it's just anger and denial to a large extent, and we have to try and move beyond that. And I think we will all win if we can have an evidence-based discussion, and then a respectful debate, and then democratically vote on which option we want to go for.
Yeah, and in the comments, quite rightly points out mutual apologies ! I think there'd probably be will probably go down well and be helpful in general anyway. Claire, if I can just turn to you again. I mean, it's just picking up this point about, I suppose, about empathy as much as anything else. How a society kind of finds common ground and comes together. And you gave us a few good examples a few minutes ago. But I mean, in terms of kind of Irish unity, how do we? What are the bridges? How do we acclimatise, assuming that perhaps there's been a border poll and there's been a vote for a united Ireland, and there's still a lot of people from a Protestant Unionist background who are not desperately happy at that outcome. What do we need to do, and how do we do it in terms of acclimatisation and helping to bring people across?
I often think that we can try and think about unionists and loyalists in a silo, but the thing that resonates most for me is watching John Harris's Anywhere But Westminster films and the podcasts. And for me, that could be just transplanted to Belfast or Portadown, or do you know, any of these kind of post-industrial parts of the north. And ultimately we can do all the flags and the symbolism and all the kind of looking after people's identity needs, but if your life is still shit and without hope, then I don't think people are going to want to be part of that conversation. So for me, there's certain things that are coming up the road that we are absolutely strapped into, whether we like it or not. And obviously the big one is climate, that we've passed the tipping point, and that these are things that are in our areas in the north. Belfast is like built over a river. The water will be lapping the shores anytime, pretty soon. And there are projects that we can look at that will create solidarity with those communities. Like when Harland and Wolff was up for sale, there was a big push by the Green Party to have that bought over by the state, to create good kind of green technology jobs and do something which actually speaks to the practical quality of life of people in Protestant working class areas. So I think just focusing on the hope in the midst of the hopelessness would be a good way to start building that empathy. And for me, that's always going to be in projects that build solidarity and look towards the realities of kind of green left change. In terms of like the bigger thing, how to bring prods in, for me, like I'm still not comfortable with the idea of Irish unity rallies, because it's far from James Connolly's vision that the Irish state still is, So I would like, for me and my friends who would be, say, kind of activists, from Protestant backgrounds, the asks are big, and, we do aspire to bigger things. So I would like to see the kind of Irish unity conversation just be allowed, just loosen up, to have it as a space that you could interrogate the concept, a space for inquisitiveness, rather than it's definitely going to be better, because I don't think there's sunlit uplands anywhere with the kind of future of food and energy insecurity that we're going into. And I think that promising too much to people will ultimately lead to people like me in unionist and loyalist areas having a really hard time in the future. So yeah, those things around just having it as an honest, and I do agree with Jeff and Ben that there are a lot of things that indicate to me that the conversation is going in one direction, but also, we can be wrong. Time goes very fast. Unexpected things can happen. And I think approaching a conversation with people where you're not definitely wrong, this thing isn't definitely inevitable, you might have something to say, we're up for listening and walking into that space and in the knowledge that we have stuff to learn ourselves as well, can really open up dialogue and lead to unexpected places.
It's really interesting, because I suppose that the commonality between, you're three very different speakers, very different books. You come from, we don't want to lump you as, you're just three Northern Protestants, and there's obviously huge differences and huge nuance and huge texture there. How do we best refer to you, I suppose? Because Kevin mentioned, he'd spoken to you about the designations. We've got loads and loads of three-letter acronyms in Irish politics. There's just millions of them, and every book has got to have a glossary. But PUL, Protestant Unionist Loyalist Community, I mean, is that a thing? Is that just a ridiculous agglomeration of people who've got less and less in common, or never had anything in common, do you think?
If I could speak briefly to that, because I just had to find out where the term came from for a footnote for the book. It was an invented tradition and imagined community circa 1998, when academics and kind of peace practitioners decided that Protestant and Catholic being religious labels were kind of rubbish ways to refer to communities, and they totally had a point in that. So their aim was to have these inclusive terms where you could, like, structurally there is a division in our society, so you could be Protestant, Unionist or Loyalist and then be meaningfully ascribed to that group. And that was really useful when it came to filling in community surveys and ticking that, yes, we had an equal number of PUL and CNR. But around about 10 years ago, probably about the time of the flag protests, it became kind of infused into popular discourse, particularly on Twitter and online. And the PUL became adopted by PUL, like Unionist and Loyalist activists, and it almost became like a bit of a Lundy leash, that it overclaiming coherence of a PUL community. Like, as you said, we're so diverse. We are all pro-unity prods, and even the three of us are incredibly diverse. So it became a bit of a noose, I think, like a bit of a burden. For me, I would quite like to detach the P from the UL to meaningfully be part of the Protestant community. I'm a child of the church. Other more secular people may disagree on that, but I also like the thranness of being part of the PUL community and just being really stubborn about what the P is and radically redefining it, as we have done.
So that's really interesting. Jeff, we've got about 5 to 10 minutes left, so I just want to get just a few last reflections if I can, and apologies if I've not asked people's specific questions in the comments box. It's more because I can't keep up with them more than anything else, and I'm trying to make notes as well, so apologies for that. But if anybody wants to have a look in, there's some really great points, and then I'll try and feed one or two in. Jeff, I just wanted to ask you about I suppose your other pet subject, which is of course, you know, centre left-wing politics. There was a poll out the other day in Dublin, which again kind of shows, you know, Sinn Féin miles in front of the other party at the moment. That's one aspect of it, but it's interesting when you tot up the kind of and designate the different parties. You know, you've got a pretty consistent centre-left majority. You know, bringing all these parties together. You know, this new island that potentially we're talking about. I mean, for the first time potentially in 100 years, you end up with explicit social democratic socialists parties in government. Is that something that would, do you feel, appeal to a chunk, and I hesitate to use the word PUL community after what Claire's just said, but you know, is that again something that might be a bridge that brings people across to say, actually, this new island is going to be, you know, more centre left. Is going to be you know a place where perhaps the practical issues that affect, you know, Protestant boys in East Belfast, it will actually get resolved for the first time. Do you think this broader sense of Ireland becoming perhaps a bit more radical, politically radical, is something that would help with that journey for Protestants in the north?
Yeah, I mean, I would have sort of thought so. I mean, it's you know, the Protestants are as a sort of, although you can get very sort of cliche sort of about this, but I mean, they are people who sort of think quite a lot about the economic sort of benefits of whatever society you want to create, you know. Yeah. So I think that's sort of one thing, and I think the other thing, and again to sort of go back, I mean, it's sort of quite interesting if you look at, for instance, the DUP's election manifesto. I think it was 2017. And it was really quite sort of radical in sort of many ways, you know, and they sort of criticized. They says we pledge we will never support Jeremy Corbyn, for instance, but then they said, i.e., enter a government with sort of Jeremy Corbyn, but then what they suggested for the sort of minimum wage was higher than what the British Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn was saying. You know, you know, putting forward. So, I mean, I think that, I mean, obviously the crisis within sort of unionism has also been fueled by the decline of the traditional industries in which sort of Protestants have had jobs, right? And I think that is a sort of further factor which sort of might push people to look for other solutions. I mean, I think things like of establishing community forums where there are a mixture of sort of people, and although those are associated with the Good Friday Agreement and sort of so on, and that in itself might mean actually take part in sort of them. But I think the sort of constant battle must be throughout to find ways and means to engage with people, as I say, and saying, okay, well, we do not want, and I mean, you know, I mean, it would be sort of terrible from my point of view, you know, after all these years that you sort of ended up with a conservative Ireland, right? It's not what I want to see, right? And I mean, what you want to see is a sort of Ireland where the sort of grassroots people have a real say. And I mean, things like, as Claire said, things like the green sort of issues and sort of all this business. I mean, I think things like that do have to be put forward. I mean, I suppose the essential thing is what we have to do. And I know this is a bit of a sort of cliche and preaching and sanctimonious and so on. But what we have to do, instead of always looking at things that divide us, we have to try and start looking forward at things can possibly unite us. And I mean, that's essentially the role. I mean, I am living in sort of London. It's not, I'm not going to tell the people who live in Ireland what to do, right? Or what sort of policies to adopt, because if I sort of did that, it would be sort of one more Brit telling the Irish what to do. So I'm not going to sort of do that. But I do think there are reasons to look for this commonality, I think. And I think, just to come back to what you said, I mean, I think the idea that there is now, you cannot really talk of the Protestants as a whole anymore, because, you know, they're not as a whole. They aren't as a whole sort of anymore. There are emerging different strands and different views. So, you know, I mean, I do think, I'm not saying the sort of future is great. If we are going to create, or the people of Ireland are going to create a better sort of country within the next sort of 10 or 15 years. But as I said, the opportunity is there, and as I said, it would be sort of great to sort of see it before I sort of, you know, pop off, so to speak, you know. Anyway, I'll leave it with that.
Thanks for that, Jeff. We're fast running out of time. I'm just going to bring Ben in a second and make just a few closing remarks. But just to give a plug to irishborderpoll.com. If you've not been having a look on the website, please do go and have a look, because there's loads of great pieces on there, and hopefully lots of people from very different perspectives as well. It's not just, you know, it's not just rah-rah. We've got people, you know, that have got interesting points to make, and if anybody wants to work with us or approach us about writing a piece, you know, we'd be all ears, and just have a look at the website and drop us a line. That would be great. I just very, very quickly, Jeff, just on the DUP as well. One of my tasks at 4 a.m. in 2010, in the day after the general election, was to working as I was for Sean Woodward at the time, was to go through the DUP's manifesto at 4 a.m. with bleary eyes to try and work out what might be a bit of an inducement for them to back a Labour government, a minority Labour government. And I looked through it, and again, you look at it and you just think, you know what, some of this actually is pretty good. Some of the industrial stuff is pretty good. Investment and all the rest of it, you know, no issues there. You know, you can take some of the kind of forward out of the equation, and actually the guts of it, you think, you know, would the SDLP be very different, or even Sinn Féin? So it's some interesting stuff there. But Ben, can I just bring you in, just to throw this one at you? I mean, there's two aspects to this. Gavin in the chat has just sort of said about, if you want to basically scare Unionists off, have a Sinn Féin Taoiseach and a Sinn Féin government in the south, because memories are still very raw, which I think is an important point. But what more should United Islanders be doing to try and pull across people from, you know, the Protestant or Protestant Unionist community that might think, you know what, I'm pragmatic enough to see which way the wind is blowing, or I work in business and I can see that actually it benefits us being back in the single market or whatever. What more, and what are the arguments and what are the issues do you feel that might pull across even fairly small numbers of people that might in the grand equation be really, really telling?
Well, I think the key thing is to focus on what is going to enable the best future for all people across this island. And I mean, like, I'm sympathetic to Scottish independence, but having looked at the referendum back in 2014, I think the Yes campaign was perhaps a bit guilty of saying everything's going to be better in an independent Scotland. And I think we have to acknowledge none of this is going to be easy. But you know, in the big picture, you can either spend the next number of decades being part of the UK, where you're trying to unpick and separate from continental Europe from the EU, which is the largest economic bloc in the world and the most successful peace project in Europe and on the continent of Europe over centuries, or you can be part of building something new and something better, where you're not focused on separation, you're focused on how can we bring our two parts of this small island together. And I know there's been all kinds of pain and anguish that we've suffered. I come back to the point, this isn't about winning one side over the other. You know, the Troubles did cover fasten partition. It wasn't a good thing. We have to move beyond that. And it's not about celebrating anything to do with the past, but it's about looking at it in the practical sense of coming back to Claire's point about how do we best address climate change? Well, I would say being part of the EU, you know, this nonsense that Brexiters come out with of saying, oh, we left the EU so we can have higher environmental standards, higher animal welfare standards. The EU doesn't set maximums on anything, it sets minimums. And for me, it's about being part of that regulatory structure that is good, and it's going to create more certainty and safeguards for people in both their personal circumstances, social circumstances, or economically, in terms of education, addressing environmental challenges, having a good healthcare. All that is going to be better achieved in a pluralist, outward-looking, open, a peace for itself island. And I think the way we do that is by going through in granular detail the various issues and setting out how we think this is better. Because I'm 100% certain if we have a discussion and debate on the practicalities and the practical issues, the Irish Unity debate will win 10 times out of 10, because the pro-union debate doesn't have that. You're not talking about the better futures. You just got to look at the sewage discharges you have around England and Wales, for example, in terms of environmental stuff. You know, you can't have that. You wouldn't have that as part of the EU. The EU, being a member of the EU, helped the UK as a whole to improve its environmental standards. And unfortunately, we've already seen a sliding back of that. So I think it's about getting into the nitty gritty and working out, putting together those building blocks, inviting people to be part of the conversation. And I think the difference is political unionism isn't engaging by and large. That's their choice. The offer is open there for them to engage. Civic unionism is engaging. It may not be engaging publicly, but it is. I know from talking to my friends, I know from talking to people in the Irish government, I know from talking to political parties, individual civic unionists are engaging on this because they can see the way things are going, they can see the opportunity, and they can see the UK fragmenting. And I think it's about creating the best future. And I think if we can set out that and look at each of those issues, whether it's health, education, economy, environment, just safeguards, you know, your right to protest. I mean, who would have thought that? That's coming under threat if you look at what's happening in Westminster. But there's a really positive case, I think, for Irish unity now, and I think it's just about having that discussion and trying to do it in a respectful way, and inviting people to be part of that, and saying you can be part of creating this, and it's a safe place for you to do that. I think is the way for us to engage.
That's
and
brilliant.
To avoid Brexit by having an evidence-based discussion and creating a plan in advance of any vote, because we don't want to have a vote and then go, well, what does the vote actually mean? Because it's crazy, 6 years on, we still have people saying, oh, well, I voted for Brexit for A, B, and C, which is totally different from the person sitting next to them. But that's a different debate. But I think it's about focusing on the practicalities, the bread and butter issues, and setting out why we think that's better, inviting those who are of a different view, who want to be part of the UK, to set out how they're going to make things better, because we're not living in nirvana right now, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point to just end on, that you know, when you're making any offer about change, you can also take a look at where you are right now and say, do you want this to carry on, or is there something better out there? That's very true. I'm going to draw it to a close because we're kind of fast running out of time, and apologies for not being able to get any more questions from the box in there. But there's been some great points raised about the NHS and All Ireland NHS. How important is that in the mix? It's featured very large in this Irish Times poll from the other day as a factor. But I just want to thank everybody for being on the call. We've had, you know, a lot of people on here tonight, and hopefully you've got a lot out of it, because I think these have been 3 fascinating speakers. Again, don't want to lump everybody together and say we've brought 3 Protestants together, tell us what you think. These are 3 writers and thinkers that have got something really original and compelling to say. So just by way of closing, thank you to Claire Mitchell. The Ghost Limb, Alternative Protestants and the Spirit of 98, available in all good bookshops. Ben Collins, Irish Unity, Time to Prepare, is out as well. And Geoffrey Bell's The Twilight of Unionism, Ulster and the Future of Northern Ireland, as featured in the Sunday Times, is out as well. So I commend all 3 books to you. And thanks for being here, and I wish you all a good night. Thank you.